All right, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to our Wake County Board of Education work session shortly after 3. I'm going to welcome everyone and hope that you had a restful and nice Labor Day weekend. We certainly had the good weather to cooperate with us, and so I hope everyone took some time to really enjoy that and take it in as this last holiday of summer. So we'll get right to it. We've got one item today, which is our COVID-19 related information on masking, testing, vaccinations, and opening of school updates. So with all of that, we've got a lot of information to cover in that one topic, so don't be fooled by just the one issue item. Turn it over to Superintendent Moore. Good afternoon, Superintendent Moore. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton and board members. As you mentioned, we have one item on the agenda today that includes a number of guests that will be joining us, as well as some information from staff. In Simbly, you have the presentation has been uploaded. The presentation includes some appendix slides that might be referenced during part of the conversation from our guests, but are not part of the formal presentation. There are also a couple of additional documents that the ABC Science Collaborative asked us to add to Simbly as backup documents, so all of that information is in. If we could go over very quickly, go ahead and bring the presentation up. Yes. Is it that many? Good God. We did cut it down. Well, there's some of those are the appendix, right? Yeah. Yeah, the appendix starts on 68. Okay. Apologize for the delay trying to figure out who's bringing up the presentation. So I'll just go ahead and get started, assuming the board members have access to the presentation, can take a look at it. And I'll start with the desired outcomes, which is on slide 2. So by the end of this presentation, we will have provided the board with information from the legislation recently signed by the governor, Senate Bill 654, just some of the highlights there from that bill. Updates from the ABC Science Collaborative, where we will welcome Dr. Danny Benjamin and I believe Dr. Kenesha Zimmerman as well, the co-chairs of the collaborative, to join us at that time. We will also have some updates from Wake County Health and Human Services, where Dr. Mishanga will be joining us. We will also provide the board, those will be our guests, and then we will provide the board with some information about the changes and upgrades that have been made to the WCPSS COVID-19 dashboard. We have several updates from different departments, operational, academics, student support services, that are part of the presentation as well. We will then provide time towards the end of the conversation specifically about recent WCPSS changes to face covering guidance and how we will move forward from that. And then information about COVID-19 testing and vaccination options that the district could consider that will be informed by the discussions and the information that's provided by our guests today. There aren't any decisions on vaccinations or testing online for the board today. The only item in the board meeting that has a decision associated with it will be related to Senate Bill 654, and I'll give that update as I go through that. Still no presentation. There's two of them in the control room, you know something's going on.
And if folks want to follow along with us, they can go to About Us on the webpage, School Board, and find board materials, and it's in there under today's work session.
Thank you, Mr. Happy. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to House Bill 654 and just get started with some of the bullet points on 654. So that is going to be on slide 4 if you're following along on the presentation. There are 5 major points of emphasis that I wanted to provide this evening out of 654. This is not everything that's in 654, but some areas that are particularly of relevance or interest to us. First is the bullet on school performance grades. So in accordance with 654, school performance grades, what we have seen traditionally over the years, the A, B, C, D letter grades for schools will not be calculated for the 21-22 school year based on the 2021 test results. Those results were released last week by the State Board of Education. You received some information on that in terms of where we are as a district and where the state is. Because there were a lot of issues, obviously, even in our county, when you look at the percent tested with who actually showed for testing and didn't show for testing, and the impact of the pandemic overall in remote learning, 654 did include a provision that school performance grades would not be calculated for 21-22 based on the 2021 performance on EOGs and EOCs. So annual report cards that do have to be created will be created based only on information that meets sort of those minimum ESSA requirements based on what the state got waivers for and what's still required to be produced. So there will still be report cards, so to speak. They just won't include a letter grade. They'll include other information that's relevant. The second bullet speaks to the designation of low-performing schools, and this information is also in 654. The State Board of Education shall not identify any designated low-performing schools or continually low-performing schools or low-performing public school units. PSU seems to be the acronym that is replacing LEA. Recently, it's been seen a lot. You've seen a lot in they don't say LEA anymore. They say PSU, public school unit. So there will not be identification for a designation of low performing, a designation of continually low performing, or a designation of continually low performing district. However, schools that have been previously identified or designated as low performing, designated as continuously low performing, or if there is a district that was designated as a low performing district, that designation will continue into the next school year. So it's kind of a status quo, no changes. Part 3 included language about school years and remote instruction for COVID emergencies. So there is a definition of remote instruction in SB 654 as instruction that is delivered to students in a remote location outside of the school facility, whether synchronously or asynchronously. And there are some exceptions, like NCVPS, North Carolina Virtual Public School, is exempted from that definition. Any e-learning course that meets the requirements of General Statute 115C 238.85, if you're interested. There's also exemptions for institution of higher education courses that are delivered through College and Career Promise, exemptions for homebound instruction, and the last bullet, any instruction provided to a student during a short or long-term suspension. Those are exempted from the definition of what virtual learning is. In addition, school districts, WCPSS, may use up to 5 remote instruction days or 30 remote instruction hours when schools are unable to open due to severe weather conditions, energy shortages, power failures, or other emergency. This language kind of goes in concert with, there's also separate language in the student accounting manual about early dismissals and that sort of thing, and what counts and what doesn't count. So this is another component in terms of what count and what doesn't count. We currently, as a district, do not have contemplated the use of remote learning days for any weather needs in our calendar as adopted for 21-22. It also indicates that public school units have the authority to make day-to-day decisions for the 21-22 school year to shift individual schools or individual classrooms that are providing temporary remote instruction as necessary due to COVID-19 exposures. So this is individual schools, classrooms, not the district. It is silent on the district. If a public school unit shifts a classroom or a school from in-person to temporary remote instruction, that must be reported to DPI within 72 hours of the shift, with the understanding that we will return to in-person instruction as soon as personnel are available or the required quarantines are complete. So there's a contemplation in that shift that it could be about quarantines, students, or it could be about staffing associated with that. But the intent is to return to in-person instruction as soon as possible. It also indicates that public school units are authorized to provide virtual instruction, a virtual academy type program as we have, during the 21-22 school year to students with the consent of parents and legal guardian. So you will note that there was a version of 654 early on that would not allow that virtual academy program within a school. It had to be a standalone school. And there was also language in a prior version of 654 that would limit the number of students that could access it. Neither one of those provisions was in the final language. What the final language indicates is that parents must agree to virtual academy program. It can be a program within a school or a separate school number. Ours in Wake County is a program within a school in that students are still linked to their base attendance school. The teachers may be from other schools in the district or other places in terms of the instruction being delivered, but they remain linked to their base school in Power School. In order to offer that virtual academy program, each public school unit must submit a virtual instruction plan to DPI by October 1st. We've not yet received the details on what that is that we will need to submit, but there is the legislation includes a requirement to submit a plan by October 1, which we will do. The next section that I wanted to highlight was in the definition of year-round schools. We worked really hard and long over the last few months to provide different versions of language that would support the practices that Wake County has had for many years of single-track calendar schools that are a subset of the multi-track year-round calendar. So the initial language for the definition of year-round schools did not include a provision that really allowed our single-track calendars to operate as a subset of multi-track. You will recall those multiple discussions earlier in the school year over the last year. The final version of 654 did include a provision that specifically states that if a school that operates single-track calendars does so with the calendar being a subset of multi-track that we operate, that is defined as acceptable in the legislation. So that is what our single tracks are. So we are good there with that language and very appreciative of all who worked to help make sure that folks understood that dilemma. I don't think the intent was ever to change what we've been doing for 20 plus years, but so it was helpful that we had been doing it for 20 plus years. And then the last section that I want to draw to your attention to that I mentioned briefly earlier is there is a section on local face covering policies in 654 for the 21-22 school year, and it is specific to 21-22 in the legislation. Each public school unit shall adopt a face covering policy, and local school boards shall vote at least once a month on whether the policy should be modified. So that is where you will see a month ago, the board voted to implement mandatory masking inside of our schools, pre-K-12. And so this evening, you have an action item on your board agenda to vote on that again, continuing the masking in schools. So you'll see that every month. I don't know that it has to be an action item every month, but what we are doing in this month's item is we are including the information that you will also see in the work session presentation about where our numbers are that will align as backup for the item in the board meeting. And I believe that our attorney also sent you some information about interpreting what 654 meant in terms of moving forward. Those are the items that I wanted to highlight from 654. Don't know if there's any specific questions on 654 that you had. Otherwise, we'll move on to our guests.
Thank you.
Ms. Kushner.
Thank you. So the virtual learning plan that you mentioned, Ms. Moore, is that something that we as a board will need to vote on, or is that something submitted to DPI by the staff?
Well, I don't know yet.
Okay.
As soon as we see the guidance on what's required, we'll let you know. But right now, I don't know.
So,
We haven't gotten that information yet.
Thank you.
Two questions, Superintendent Moore. I know one, you said it was, the legislation was silent with regard to closing of the district. And our attorneys contemplated a little bit about who did have the authority, or is there some sense of who has the authority, or where we need to seek the authority if we needed to close the district, entire district?
So we have, I have contacted council to find out how that process would even be contemplated, since the legislation doesn't speak to it. And Ms. Dubison may be prepared to answer some of this, but in my early conversations with Jonathan Blumberg, he has indicated, and he is working actually with the county attorney to further this conversation, that it would not be the board that would be able to make a decision on its own to close the district, but that perhaps the local health department would need to be involved, the board would need to be involved, that there might be a recommendation that would move forward. But when you think about how the decision was made on the statewide level from the governor's office, our attorney believes that provides a flow for how that decision would be made at an individual district level. And I'll let Ms. Dubison fill in anything else.
Sure. I'll just note, as you said, that what this legislation does take away the ability of a board of education to move the district to remote instruction. Local boards of health and the state director of health have pretty broad authority under their emergency management powers to implement infection control measures, which can include closing a public facility. But you know, it is not something that anyone's tried to do before without, you know, obviously with this legislation putting an obstacle there. And so ideally, it would be essentially a joint effort. But at a minimum, the health department would need to be driving that process. But ideally, the Board of Education would be in agreement, so as not to get into any gray area about authority there.
And that's why I raised it, because I think it's the idea, while it's difficult to speak to the spirit or the intent of the legislature, I don't think the idea was to strip school boards of that authority, but perhaps to in a stronger way, encourage or almost force the collaboration between school boards, local health departments, and the county. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know if I would speculate as to the intent. I would say that the effect was to strip the local board of its ability to act unilaterally.
Unilaterally make that
Right.
decision, yeah.
But certainly, as I said, the health department still has those infection control measures that they have to implement as they deem necessary. And then, of course, you continue to have the ability to close classrooms or schools as necessary due to quarantines or like immediate infection risk.
Okay. And then Superintendent Moore, my second question with regard to the monthly masking approval. We talked a little bit about it, I think, in executive, and maybe get some sense from the board pretty quickly. just in thinking that it would be an action item that we would have to vote on, particularly because we're not, and I don't know if, Ms. Kushner, if you all have talked about this from policy, are we not actually adopting it? I think I saw an email from council that we don't necessarily have to adopt it as policy or change policy if we are including it as a action item and we're voting on it each month. Is that, I'm sort of looking
That's
at
our
you and,
interpretation,
Yeah.
yes, that it doesn't necessarily mean in a board policy manual, but it means you have an identifiable plan that the board has approved and will continue to review every month.
okay.
Thank you for getting that clarification, Chair. That was my understanding. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
Any
so
other questions?
let me just
from
make
board?
sure. I'm trying to see if our guests are online and can hear us now. Our next section would be Dr. Benjamin and Dr. Zimmerman. Are you guys on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great,
Just a
thanks.
reminder to all board members, we got to turn mics on when we're speaking and asking questions so that he can hear.
Given all what's happening in the hospital today, it would just be me today. At Duke, we're at the point where the Children's Hospital has stopped elective procedures and elective admissions. I know one of the board members had some questions about hospitalization rates, and they're considerable. Go ahead, next slide, please. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so we've received over the past month, and this includes from a number of districts, essentially the same questions copy pasted, but well, perhaps they were authored by an individual person, but where the district's name is substituted or the county's name is substituted. And I think in reading those questions, I just think it's worth going over a couple of facts about this virus compared to last year. Last year, we had a virus that had an R naught of 2. That means each person on average infects 2 other people. This year, we have a virus with an R naught somewhere between 5 and 10. The best estimate is 8 at the moment. That's similar to chickenpox. That means each person on average will infect 8 others. Essentially, you are dealing with a different pandemic with a different virus. And I think your folks in the central office can testify to that. They were told to anticipate that, and I think that they've experienced that. Go ahead, next slide, please. So let's look at a case in point here. This is in Marin County, California. This just came out about a week or so ago. This was an elementary school classroom. The teacher involved was in a classroom where you'll notice that the students and the teacher all maintained 6 foot of distancing. This was a classroom where there are very large windows all along both side walls. All of those windows were open. The doors were open. There was also revamped filtration and a within-room air filtration system that was portable as well. So about a good ventilation and distancing as one is going to see. Teacher decided that it would be a good idea to not get the vaccine. She seemed to think it was a good idea to come to a public place without a mask on, despite a mask policy. And she seemed to think it was a good idea to read aloud to the class without a mask on. Those 3 decisions tend to co-travel, by the way. She gets, obviously, you know where this is going. She's infected. The health department comes in. They actually do whole genome sequencing. So that means every virus that they isolate, they do analysis of the genetics of each virus to prove conclusively that the children got the infection from the teacher. There were 27 total cases identified. So one teacher resulted in the infection of 26 others. Of the 24 students in her classroom, 22 were tested. and just over half of those tested positive. The different children in separate grades also tested positive, as did several family members who agreed to get tested. This was in, by the way, these infections occurred over a 48-hour period. So with this level of infectivity, COVID in its current variant is much more infectious than RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus. You may remember reading about RSV, how we had some cases this summer as opposed to the usual winter. RSV, just as a reminder, is infectious enough that the entire birth cohort is infected by age 2. COVID is multiple times more infectious than RSV. This means that sometime between May of 2022 and May of 2023, if Delta remains the predominant variant, virtually every American will either have been infected with COVID or have been vaccinated with COVID, or both. Go ahead, next slide, please. So you're in this transition period where a substantial fraction of your population is not vaccinated, cannot be vaccinated, or has elected not to be vaccinated. So this will back up one slide. This text slide with the Delta variant, we continued the work of reporting from the spring. If you'll remember, 100 school districts, including Wake, submitted data to us in the spring as part of legislation. 20 of those school districts moved forward voluntarily. Wake was one of those school districts as they went through summer school and year-round learning. This includes 70,000 students and staff from June to August. So what's nice about this is it's really when the Delta variant is the predominant variant in North Carolina. And these schools did an outstanding job to prevent within-school transmission. Over 600 student cases were acquired outside of school, almost 200 staff cases were acquired outside of school, and only 65 infections were acquired at school, within school transmission. You all were under the mask mandate then, all these districts were, and adhered to it throughout the summer. We collected data up through mid-August. And the secondary attack rate, you all were under the old quarantine rules, was less than 3%, it's about 2.6%. And then the ratio of infections acquired outside of school compared to those acquired in school were about 13. So one person on average in the community with the Delta is going to infect 8 others. If you don't mask in a closed, confined area like schools, one person has the potential to infect 20 or 30 others in a 48-hour period. And in contrast, if you masked with fidelity, it takes 13 people infected to infect just one other person. So there's a 100-fold difference here. So really, we're the 2 safest public buildings in a county in North Carolina. One's the hospital as it relates to COVID. We have very few within hospital transmissions of COVID. We have universal masking. We have a very high vaccination rate. We mask indoors and outdoors. And we have almost no within a building transmission. And similarly, the second safest place is going to be a Wake County school. Go ahead, next slide, please. So here's another way of looking at it. This is a graphical display. The blue line is infections acquired outside of school. The purple line is infections acquired inside school. You'll note that as the pandemic gets worse, it's more important to have children in school, paradoxically. Go ahead, next slide, please. Set, thank you. So when we've moved now to something that we call decision support, and we've gotten away, a little bit less emphasis from broad policy, kind of this is the science that really gets supported here, in the sense that there are some decisions that a school board really does need to make about the details of their masking policy. As infectious as the Delta is, this is in contrast to last year. Last year, if you kept your mask on, except during the winter surge, if you kept your mask on during the fall and during the spring, you kept it on indoors, you could do a lot of different things and not really have real problems with COVID. That's not going to be quite so true with Delta. And as a school district, you're going to want to be making some decisions about just how much quarantining you want to deal with and just how many infections you want to transpire on your school property. And so one of the things that we've done is we let you know how much infections you've had in your particular school district. And for Wake, your infection data looked good. And we take into account what kind of policies you have. We're a national program now. Less than half of our districts are in the state of North Carolina. We go through your legal ramifications, and then we try to standardize the comparison by either the secondary attack rate, which is an estimate of close contacts is the denominator, and the within school transmission is the numerator. We always had a target of less than 5% for the ancestral variant. It's unknown what it should be for the Delta variant, but for you all, it was about 2.5% within Wake, within the state of North Carolina. And then the ratio of primary infections to secondary, the target for that was greater than 10 for the ancestral variant, and that was greater than 10 for Wake County for the Delta variant. I'm not sure what that should be for Delta yet, but the fact that you guys are still above 10 is reassuring. That's a good sign. We compare your districts to others in the state, others of similar size. Wake is not the largest school district that we work with. We talk about your community rates, your vaccine uptake, and your policies. So overall, we put the Wake County data as actually doing quite well. Certainly in the top 10% in school districts in the country, your performance is quite good. On the other hand, there's probably there's maybe more quarantine and more infections than you want. And so some of the things that we talk about with you all are what do you want to do about extracurriculars, adherence, lunch, recess, testing, and vaccination. Go ahead, next slide, please. Let's skip this slide in the interest of time. It's publicly available. It basically says what the text said. So the leadership, go ahead, next slide. Some of the things we talked over with leadership for Wake County is the monitoring plan. Now, this first slide here are two items that can be implemented quickly. Data are available. That number one, they work. There's strong data in the healthcare environment for both of these. There's also data certainly for the monitoring plan that it can reduce not only quarantine but also within school transmission. And lunch has very strong data from the healthcare environment. So based on our experience as a healthcare system, and by our, I mean globally, with hand hygiene in healthcare, it turns out that without supervision, people don't wash their hands very much. Only about 70% of people wash their hands after using a public restroom. In the 1990s, only about 50% of healthcare personnel washed their hands before and after interacting with patients. So in order to tighten that up, healthcare systems went toward a monitoring plan where if you go to any major facility, there'll be infection control staff going through the system, counting the number of people, their health interactions, and making sure that hand hygiene compliance is in the high 90s. This in turn has resulted in very high compliance rates because while HR action is not taken on the spot, the details of that have been shared with staff. It's not an HR action, but it is been shown to reduce infections. There are 2 school districts that have done this here in North Carolina. They've used slightly different methods in their approach. And one of the school districts which followed the plan that I think the Wake County staff liked some of those details, saw not only a reduction in quarantine, an increase in mask adherence, but also a reduction in infection. Lunch, was very simple. We asked for it with the ancestral variant. We told superintendents throughout the state in March, actually, to go ahead and purchase. Back in March, we told them to purchase outdoor eating equipment because of what we anticipated might happen this fall. You'll see a lot of transmission here. And when we do see transmission in the hospital, it's really around meal times. You really want to have eating outside whenever possible. Groups of folks eating together is not allowed in most hospital or outpatient clinic or health department clinic environments. Any kind of healthcare, it's now you're either eating outside or you're eating alone in your office with the door closed. You can't give every third grader their own office with the ability to close the door. So you really want to distance and to eat outside, and the importance of limiting time. Now, some folks have expressed concern about limitations around talking, and the limitations around talking are derived from 2 things. One has to do with upper airway anatomy. Think about talking, eating, and breathing. Pick 2. The other is and the kids can get distracted, as can the adults if they're busy talking rather than eating. The other thing is you can expel a 20-fold higher concentration of virus and viral particles and the particles that transmit the virus while talking, let alone yelling. So that 20-fold difference is part of that's part of that suggestion. That no talking sort of thing has not been shown to impact transmission. However, it has not been studied within schools. So that basis for that recommendation to consider that last year, when we talked to you about it last year, and if you're going to consider that this year, has to do with respiratory physiology. Go ahead, next slide, please. Now, outdoor masking. So this has to do with recess. Here's where we don't have as strong a data. In general, the CDC guidance is people do not need to wear masks when outdoors. Unless they are unvaccinated and in a crowded situation, it is recommended for indoor physical education or recess. So again, here's a place where there just is not strong data one way or the other, but it's an item for discussion for us because there's the concern for spread at recess, and it's primarily due to the reality of recess. It's not 8 children spread across a kickball field. It's 8 children huddled up on an iPhone on a bench, right? And so if you can maintain at all times distancing, that's a very different equation than recess where the kids kind of clumped together. And consider this kind of step based on cases that are occurring in your district. The bottom line is the risk is going to be higher at recess without masking, but the amount of risk is unknown. This is in contrast to masking indoors where it's definitive. The risk in sports and vaccination where the data are extraordinarily strong. Go ahead. Now sports, just as a reminder, if you are a fan of CDC guidance as it relates to whether or not one should mask outdoors, you might also note that CDC guidance has items around sports. So this is abstracted from a table in the CDC guidance. It is not taken word for word. I've edited it for brevity, but it's publicly available. So high-risk sports and activities versus low and intermediate risk sports and activities. So in low and intermediate risk, CDC gives an example of golf here. If you're in a high transmission, which of course every county in North Carolina is a high transmission, screen once a week if you are not fully vaccinated. High risk sports and activities, go ahead and don't stay on this slide for a second. Thank you. High risk sports and activities should either be canceled or have all participants fully vaccinated. Now, as a reminder, high transmission under this guidance is 100 cases per 100,000 per 14 days. And Wake County is approximately 4 times higher than that right now. Not only is every county in North Carolina 2 or 3 times higher than that, Wake County is almost 4 times higher than that. So go ahead, next slide, please. What does this come from? Well, it comes from a number of studies. We've published a couple of them. The CDC has published a couple of them. Other investigators throughout America published them. A wrestling tournament had a secondary attack rate between 30 and 70%. This is with the ancestral variant last year. So this was the not so infectious variant. And the spread here can be substantial in these close contact sports. Go ahead, next slide, please. In North Carolina, it was initially thought that the indoor sports were really where all the ancestral virus transmission was occurring. 75% from the winter surge, 75% of the within-school transmission in high schools occurred during extracurricular activities. These were primarily indoors. Soccer was maybe happening here or part of this. When we went to the outdoor sports environment, it was still 50% of the within-school transmission was occurring in high schools. Of the within-school transmission in high school with the Alpha variant, you had 50% of within-school transmission. Now this is in addition to the data from multiple different investigators looking across time, looking across sports. This is actually entirely predictable. Remember that, yes, SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, it's new, it's only 18 months, I think, that you guys have been thinking about RNA viruses. But those of us in medicine, we've been dealing with RNA viruses for a while. In fact, the single-strand positive RNA viruses account for about 1/3 of all viruses. We've also been dealing with coronaviruses for a while. 4 strains of corona cause, other corona strains cause common cold, obviously, for years. There's a reason, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which had a much, much higher mortality rate, a much, much smaller number of people were infected. The mortality was much higher than COVID-19. Dealt with that. There's a reason why SARS-CoV-2 has the name SARS-CoV-2, because that implies a first one. right? So we've been dealing with this type of virus for a while. So this type of exposure in the intimacy of close contact, whether it's a Norwalk virus, which has been well described, or coronavirus, whether it's by respiratory, whether it's by GI, this is not something unpredictable or new. And there are a number of districts that now have started to require vaccination in order to participate, in order to comply with CDC guidance, play sports. They're really trying to salvage sports throughout the academic year. Go ahead, next slide, please. One of the advantages to having a vaccinate to participate or vaccinate all of one's staff is that essentially it takes COVID back to much less dangerous than influenza. Essentially brings it back to the community to dealing with something between the common cold and influenza. Brings the mortality way down. It brings hospitalization much down. And of course, for children, it makes COVID nearly negligible. So go ahead, next slide, please. The data, obviously, for randomized, for vaccine efficacy, randomized trials reduces hospitalization and death anywhere from the low 90s to 99%. Hospitalization and death with the Delta variant, again, these studies range from the low 90s in reduction to 99%. Vaccination makes sports in school districts essentially a near zero risk event for the participants, get you down to less than 1 per million serious morbidity or mortality. Go ahead, next slide. Now, as far as encouraging vaccination or requiring vaccination or testing or requiring vaccination in order to participate, somewhere between 35 and 40% of K through 12 staff in America right now are under some type of COVID-19 mandate across the country. The initial requirements were put in place by large districts, but several states have followed. Most of the policies actually were initially crafted at the district level. Multiple districts every business day are increasing the number of staff required to be vaccinated, and it's a mix, which is that varies between vaccinate as a condition of employment or vaccinate or frequent testing, and those requirements have been limited to the primary series of vaccinations, so the 2-shot series. 10 states now have some type of one of these 2 types of policy in place. North Carolina, a couple of school districts have come forward with this. Large districts that have adopted the mandate. So if you look at the 20 largest districts in the country, there's obviously Wake is one of those. They tend to, the other 19 tend to fall into 2 groups. Group number 1 is located in Florida, Georgia, or Texas. Things are not going well there. And they don't, vaccine requirement is not anywhere near their agenda. The other 10 are, have some type of mandate in place. Here's a partial listing here around the vaccine mandates that they have as it relates to either staff, athletes, or both. Next slide, please. And one of the questions is, gosh, vaccines don't impact how infectious people are. Of course, that's not correct. While vaccines are extraordinary in reducing hospitalization, major morbidity, and death, they also have a substantial impact on infectivity, not only to the individual, but especially at the population level, even with the Delta variant. This has been seen in multiple studies, whether it's in the United Kingdom, where you're looking at up to 50 or 60% efficacy as it relates to infection. Israel, studies out of Israel, even Israel where the data look the worst, and there's some reasons for that that are a little bit beyond the scope of today's discussion. You have even there a 40% reduction as far as acquired infection. I would view that as the floor. There's just some unique aspects to both the Israeli data, the population there, and again, how close people live together that make it difficult to apply as low a number as that to the U.S. Go ahead, next slide, please. And why is there some protection from infection, and why is that considerable? Yes, the viral load as measured by cycling time. Remember, the cycling time will just tell you how quickly you're able to detect the presence of virus. It does not tell you infectious virus or virus that's able to infect another human being. But the first couple of days, you have a high viral load. And that's not a surprise given the immunology around the Delta variant. But you can see quite quickly that with the vaccinated folks, their viral load goes down more quickly than unvaccinated folks. Go ahead, next slide, please. So you often have a good way to think about it is an unvaccinated person is 2 to 6 times more likely to get infected, depending on what study you read. And an unvaccinated person is 2 to 5 times more likely to infect others. Again, depending on the study. So let's think about a doubling of risk. What sorts of things do you do where you double your risk? Well, drinking and driving doubles your risk of a car accident. Not wearing a seatbelt doubles the risk of death. Speeding doubles the risk of death. Texting increases the odds of accidents 6-fold. So, you really you want a public policy that's consistent with drunk driving while testing, while speeding, or not. Go ahead, next slide, please. So this brings to mind, gosh, is what we're doing safe? Well, you can have adverse events that are in the life cycle of the development of the vaccine. So during testing, you test on about 50,000 people. Maybe you get some bad safety events. That happened with the RSV vaccine in the 60s. This is a big reason why we don't have an RSV vaccine. It's pretty common. We're past that. We've already done those trials. You can get them in the first 10 million people who get the vaccine. These are your post-marketing study. That happened with rotavirus during the early part of this century. That was removed from the market. We're past that. We've now given the vaccine to 190 million people. Then you can have late impact events. You've given the vaccine to more than 10 million people, and you kind of figure out over time, oh gosh, what might happen here. This is after you've given it to about 10 million people, and this occurred with the oral polio vaccine. Again, we've given the COVID vaccine to over 190 million Americans, let alone what we've given it worldwide. Then there's safety events relative to the administration of the vaccine. This is what the individual might experience. So I could feel lousy in the first 24 hours afterward. That's very common. Headache, tired. I could get a sore arm first week, also common. Very uncommon, but happens 1 week to 6 weeks post-administration is like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which happened with the flu vaccine in the 70s. It's very unlikely, but it does occur. Now, if we're talking about events that occur more than 6 months post-vaccination, okay, so like people talk about, I'm worried about fertility 5 years from now. we've been vaccinating people for over 150 years. Now, in the history of vaccinology, over a century and a half, 2 centuries of giving vaccines, over thousands of licenses have been studied, over hundreds of products have been licensed, over tens of billions of people have received those products, hundreds of billions of doses have been given. This late onset might occur a year, 3, 5 years from now. It's never been reported. It's never happened. Go ahead, next slide, please. So over 190 million Americans have received at least 1 dose of the mRNA vaccine. Now, this is different from the J&J and AstraZeneca. We're talking here is the mRNA platform, so Moderna or Pfizer. There have been no deaths in the United States linked to the vaccine as of September 1st. That's an astounding safety track record. Okay, that's safer and a stronger safety track record than any medical product on the market. Safer than any medicine, safer than any vaccine, safer than any over-the-counter medicine, safer than Advil, Tylenol, a supplement, a vitamin. It's safer than food. Much more people are going to die from anaphylaxis of nut allergies than 0 out of 190 million. It's safer than giving water. Hyponatremia from excess water consumption in young infants happens every year and occasionally in older people. Okay. It's safer than supplemental oxygen. So not only are the well-known impacts to preterm infants of too much supplemental oxygen and chronic lung disease, but hyperbaric oxygen or excess ventilation. This is 0 out of 190 million people. It's amazing. Go ahead, next slide, please. So here are the vaccines for which we've needed to get mandates in order to achieve widespread population in over 80% of either children or adults, for that matter. Everything from smallpox to chickenpox and everything in between. The vaccines for which we've achieved widespread uptake across a nation without mandates are none. Smallpox is interesting in that despite having a mortality of over 30%, folks did not want to take it without a mandate. Polio is an interesting case of revisionist history. People my parents' age will talk to you about remembering how they lined up at school for this. And that was true in 1955, right after the vaccine was successful, the vaccine trial was successful. But that's because there were only 9 million doses on hand. So yes, they lined up, but it was much the same way that we lined up in December and January for the COVID vaccine. And in fact, by 1965, the coverage for polio was only 56%. And in point of fact, my spouse did not get the polio vaccine until the Commonwealth of Virginia mandated it when we were in elementary school together. Go ahead, next slide, please. So, given that the R0 is 8, every American is going to become infected with it, be vaccinated with it, or both. And really, what are your goals? In addition to the morbidity, mortality now, failure to really vaccinate not only the U.S. but the globe is going to substantially increase the probability of a variant that escapes the vaccine and will allow us to restart the cycle of the past 18 months. Go ahead, next slide, please. So a couple of things that we did not discuss in much detail. I just wanted to go over why we're not mentioning very much. Ventilation, the concept's excellent, but as been shown, just has not been shown to reduce infections in the school environment. And in contrast to other things that don't have much in the way of data, the expense is not trivial. Things that we've suggested that you do around ventilation are facilitating eating outside, You've got the upgrades that you've already done. Maybe some things around where you just simply can't mask. Ventilation really starts to come online. Testing is not a prevention strategy. Testing is a control strategy. So this is why the kind of the vaccinate or test policies that have started to emerge. In the vaccinate or test policies, you're accepting the fact that you're going to put athletes or adults in the building at risk, and you want to limit the spread across schools, or you want to limit, not necessarily eliminate, but limit some of the rapid spread. And so widespread testing, while it hasn't been proven, it can help you limit the spread if you're going to have a higher risk population, and your higher risk populations are unvaccinated adults and extracurricular folks in extracurricular activities. And sometimes I'll conflate athletics with the words extracurricular activities, and forgive me for that kind of sloppy language. Go ahead, next slide, please. So again, quarantine, I know all the school districts are studying that. The risk of the transmission is low if you are mask on mask. If you are vaccinated for reasons that we've already discussed, as it relates to your own risk and your risk of transmitting it to others, you are not necessarily required to quarantine. So you could essentially eliminate almost all of your quarantine by October 1st. And this is how to do it. Just have the staff vaccinated. You're vaccinated under current public health policy. You don't have to quarantine the adults. You have universal masking indoors. This way the kids don't have to do mask. Kids are mask on mask. Those kids don't have to quarantine according to both DHHS and CDC guidelines. Eat, distance outside when possible, and vaccinate as a condition of participation in extracurricular activity. And now your quarantine is really going to be on the order of 1 to 5% of what it is today. Go ahead. So overall, you guys have really done a solid job to prevent within school transmission of the Delta variant. That's based on 2 months of data. That's July, summer school. And summer school is a little different environment than the first week or so of school. You are getting, and some of the staff have discussed that there are more clusters and more within school transmission than some of them view as optimal. I don't have a judgment on that one way or the other. Your ratio of primary to secondary is good. If you want to improve on that, if you want to reduce your quarantine, you reduce your within school transmission, these are the recommendations for items for you to discuss and to consider that are supported by science, the fifth of which has the least amount of scientific support as it relates specifically to schools, but nonetheless has strong scientific basis in respiratory physiology and the R naught of the virus. I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. I'm wondering if maybe we take a few minutes for some questions now rather than waiting until, because Health Department will be next. And then specific to information in the slides or question you may have, knowing that the discussion that will happen later, he probably won't still be online for.
All right, start with Ms. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for the information, Dr. Benjamin. Just had two quick questions. With the first original strain of SARS-CoV-2, we were told that children did not contain as much viral load. And I was wondering how, when we're looking at especially on slide 22 with the given that the majority of children, of course, all children under the age of 12 are not vaccinated, does that remain true? That is their viral load heavier than a vaccinated 15-year-old, for example?
You're on mute, Dr. Benjamin.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just congratulating you on a very thoughtful question for which the data are extremely sparse. So it's unknown at this point, because so many of those studies on viral load have been done in older patients, the precise answer, but it's very clear that they are able to transmit very efficiently. I would speculate that they have a slightly less viral load than adults, and I would speculate, based on the information from the ancestral variant, that they have a viral load of shorter duration. Comparing young children to adults, unknown, but that's looking at the early data, that's my estimate. And I think that they have a considerably higher viral load than adults or older children who had the ancestral variant. And the reason for that latter speculation is the viral load differential is approximately 1,500 times higher with the Delta variant, adult to adult.
Thank you for that. And then I just had one other quick question. If our guidance, if you have offered any guidance or suggestions or research towards the Delta variant and its impact on an activity like band.
Yeah, it's another good question, and my short answer is I don't know. I would anticipate that band is the sort of thing that is in between golf and football, if you will. I got asked about ROTC, and so much of this is the devil's in the details. So I got asked about ROTC in the 6 or 8 months ago, and I said, "Oh well, if you keep them distance, it sounds like it would be okay." I didn't hear back from the district for 3 or 4 months, and they called me up with a cluster that they had because since I had said, "Hey, it seems pretty reasonable, you guys ought to be able to keep them distance," they interpreted that to mean we're going to take a bus with all of our JROTC kids out to the Midwest, where they're going to be unmasked while on the bus and in the hotel room and with other ROTC folks for a few days. The kids come back and they wondered, hey, why are all these kids infected? So it's really around the details of what happens, but extracurriculars, regardless of the type of extracurriculars, there's a little higher concern there because there's less control. And I would put the arts, theater, band, that sort of thing, as kind of in the low to intermediate experience. Better information and more details pending.
And would that include an overnight band trip then?
Oh, well, that's a whole different kettle of fish.
Right.
Yeah, that's different.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Dr. Martin.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Benjamin, for some of the information. I generally concur with most of the recommendations you provided. My question, however, comes to continuing concern with your statements talking about the primary to secondary infection rate and thus the fundamental conclusion that school buildings are ultimately safe. You talk on slide 9 of repeating your study from before, I'd asked you a question about this before and never got an answer, and I'm afraid the same thing is happening now. You talk about the 627 students and 190 primary staff cases acquired outside of school, but only 60 students and 5 secondary cases at school. Am I to conclude that this reports the same as you reported before, that only a small fraction of those 627 students and 190 staff had an identified origin, whereas the secondary in-school definitely had identified origin? So are you not comparing identified origin to all cases instead of school identified origin to total identified origin?
The origin is not always identified. However, the vast majority of the outside of school transmission have a identified origin. For example, an overnight church event, a sibling who is outside of school but was initially infected, and the within school transmissions, some outside of transmissions, the within school transmission do not always have an identified source within school. That there are times when no other source can be identified outside of school, and the district will default to within school transmission. How quickly the district moves to default, or the local health department, sometimes it's the local health department that makes the adjudication, sometimes they're partnering with the school district. That has some variance district to district.
With all due respect, you know that I've been keeping track of data very carefully, and I see no evidence of a lax default or a ready default. Let's just take, for example, the Wake County numbers, which is why I'm concerned about this issue. Just in the last week, that's the week of starting August 29th, as reported on the Wake County dashboard, there were 61 cases identified as having a community household spread. There were 119 cases identified as having a suspect in school spread. There were 377 cases with no identification. Like I say, I have no indication that the suspect in school is conservative, that if in doubt, will err on our responsibility. Quite the contrary, I think it tends to go, if in doubt, that is a no indication. It's a pending. So I'm pretty sure that almost all those suspect in schools, we pretty much know that there was something going on in schools. So that's a total of 557 total cases in the Wake County school system just last week. 119 suspected in-school transmission divided by 557 total cases is 31.6% of the cases were suspected in-school transmission. 61 out of 557 is only 10%, and that 61 was the community suspected. Now, if we took probably a more honest assessment of that data, we would look at that 61 plus 119, that sums to 180 cases for which there is an identification indicated. Of those, that would be 34% community household and 66% suspected in school. You could take that ratio and normalize it to the 377 that are unidentified, and now you could get a reasonable approximation of the origin of those unidentified cases. You could take an even very conservative approach to that, but even if we take those 119 suspected school cases divided by our total cases, that's 31.6% in-school transmission, which is way higher than anything that you indicated. Now, I'm not here trying to say the sky is falling and schools are unsafe for our children. I think we're working really hard to keep them safe. I think there are pockets where we've got problems, pockets where we don't. but I think we're going to get ourselves into more trouble if we put on too much rose-colored glasses and say everything's good, because there are clear problems here. If 31.6% of the identified cases are identified as in-school transmission, that's not a rosy scenario, and I think we need to be realistic. And that's why I'd really strongly encourage you to go back and look at your data, because your data is leading to conclusions that are frankly not wise if we want to get this thing under control.
So let me push back on you on two things. Number one, the methods described are not, the North Carolina experience is not the only one that uses these methods. And these methods, when they've been compared to testing, have been robust. When the method as you describe, as I understand it, has actually not been supported when doing whole genome sequencing.
Excuse me, on that one, I have to say
Dr.
that
Martin.
it is your method
Dr.
that would
Martin.
compare 119 cases to 557 cases, and that's 31.6%. That's your method, that's not my method.
Sorry, if I could go on just for a little bit without being interrupted, that'd be great. So so the second item is, once those adjudications for your school district with your health department and your school district are made, I'm happy to review those with your district. But what I can only review final adjudications, and it has been decidedly our policy not to wade into the adjudication process because we want to keep a hands-off approach to that for some obvious reasons. And if, however, you remain concerned, there's a simple solution, and that is to do whole genome sequencing. It's not a trivial cost, and if you'd like to look into that, you can discuss that with your health department and allocate resources to that. And those methods are published and publicly available. I don't think that you will find that to be a good use of resources, but I would be, if you are going to use resources that way, I would be happy to talk with the board or school staff about doing that. And then I tell you where we do have agreement is that this is a different virus than last year. And if you want to provide a safe work environment and a safe education environment, you're going to need to do more than what you did last year.
And we are in agreement on that point. I respectfully request that you do not pursue this diversion. You don't need to do the whole genome testing. I've never said that. You can look at the specific data. I'm not weighing in on in-school suspected transmission or not. That's coming from the health department. That's not me coming up with data. That's reported data on our website. You need to look at those numbers. The numbers are higher than you report. Again, I am not calling for a sky is falling kind of approach to this, but equally to make the declarative statement that schools are the second safest building next to hospitals to be in is actually likely a risk. I think that's partly why we are where we are, because back in June, July, when everything was going down, we went under the assumption that masks were enough. Masks were not enough. It was clear that masks were not going to be enough. But, don't need to distance, don't need extra precautions, masks are going to be enough because everything's going to be under control. That wasn't the case. That's not the case now. It's not going to be the case. So there's more work that we need to do, and I respectfully request that this rose-colored glasses that says everything's okay be taken off, and that we realistically evaluate the data.
Mrs. Cash.
So when the health department comes through the Wake County, I'd love to investigate that a little more because of the fact of the tracing, because I do think we get defaulted to many times. And hopefully we can talk about that. But for Dr. Benjamin, I had two questions, and they both went around the vaccinated and unvaccinated. And at first, I want to thank you. You did a really good job of answering some questions I sent to you earlier last week, so I appreciate that so much. And it was very good information. It made sense. But as far as the fact that the unvaccinated are still picking up the virus and are usually asymptomatic, is there a reason, or is it because of the viral load that you were talking about, that we wouldn't test vaccinated and unvaccinated athletes the same way?
Yeah, so so part of it relates to the viral load. Part of it relates to how long they are shedding infectious virus. Part of it relates to the likelihood that they themselves will be infected. In order for a screening program, a widespread screening program takes considerable resources. And when you start doing testing of both, when you start doing widespread testing, you want to do that of your folks that are the highest risk.
Okay.
Make sure that you can do them first. And then after you gain that experience, if you want to take testing into other directions, talk through that.
Okay.
But test your highest risk people first.
Well, I appreciate you answering that way, because I had a little bit of problem with that, but when you started talking about the viral load, it made so much more sense to me now as why we would possibly be treating the vaccinated differently than the unvaccinated. So thank you for that. I had just one quick other question. So when on slide 29, and this is probably what's going to be talked more about with the Wake County Health Department, the fact that you listed very clearly, which I thought you did a great job of, the 4 steps that we would eliminate a lot of our quarantining. You said that universal masking indoors would help us eliminating quarantining, but our Wake County Health Department still quarantines our masked children. So is that more of a North Carolina recommendation, and we're just more strict in Wake County? Because it hasn't really helped us not quarantine as much.
All right, so your local health department retains control.
Right.
And I definitely should not be getting into the details of what happens in Wake as it relates to quarantine. But in general, when 2 children are indoors with reliable masking, and they are both the infected and the exposed are masked, then according to CDC and to NCDHHS guidelines, there's not a compelling reason to quarantine. And in fact, our data and the data of others has shown that the risk is low enough that quarantine scientifically is not warranted. Now, there are exceptions to that. Those exceptions are, there are counties where if an adult is involved, that changes the equation for the local health department. The second place that you can see masked children get quarantined is if they are eating lunch together, especially if they're eating lunch together for a prolonged period of time close to each other. And then the third place that you can see some difficulty is that there are concerns that although the children had a mask on their person, they were not wearing it correctly. And this is part of why the monitoring plan can help you in reduction of your quarantine.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Carter?
All right, thank you. And I just wanted to start out, because I know at the beginning you made a comment about board members had questions about hospitalization rate, and they are considerable. And I'm assuming I'm one of the board members you're referring to. I have submitted multiple questions to you beginning on August 26th and haven't received one response to 3 of my emails. So I'm glad that you're here today. So could you expand a little bit on that statement that you made? Do you have numbers for Wake County in regards to children hospitalization rate? And I believe I also submitted the ICU numbers, asked about that as well for 5 to 17.
Yeah, the hospitalization or ICU admissions by county is simply going to be something that's beyond the scope of ABC at this time. What's provided for you in your packet, can somebody from the staff, well, it's provided for you in your packet. In the appendix is a slide from a CDC article published Friday that addresses national rates of hospitalization, which are exceedingly high at the moment relative to typical beginning of September. Locally, the major institutions nearby are at the point that they are stopping elective admissions and elective procedures. That is an astounding step.
Okay, all right.
Is it the slide, I'm sorry, on page 71, COVID-19 hospitalizations, children, adolescents?
Right.
Yeah, I was wanting the local, but he doesn't have it. Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Carter.
Oh, that's okay. I guess, okay. Then I guess I'll go to, I had a question of clarification. So for the mask outside in your recommendations there, and sorry, I had to change slides because we were talking about something else. It has masking at recess. So are you recommending masking of athletes outside or just mask at recess?
Well, if I could give you optimal approach to athletes, it would be to vaccinate them, and then you are essentially taking the risk and moving it to 2019. Now, you're not talking about having to mask when you're participating or test. That experience for those kids becomes extraordinarily safe. And because of the high rate of transmission in your community and the or not, that's why the CDC has their recommendation of either vaccinate or put your extracurricular activities on hold. What I'm trying to do is to put you all in a position where you can keep the extracurricular activities with highest probability of success and the least mortality. Because we will get into a situation in this state where, as a result of the decision not to vaccinate the child, as a result of the decision to allow the child to participate in sports, we will have children admitted to intensive care in this state as a result of SARS-CoV-2. We will have deaths as a result of that. And what I'd like to do is for y'all to avoid that.
Okay, so the recommendation is vaccination.
It's vaccinate. It's the strongest scientific merit. Then everything else after that, vaccinate or test, vaccine or add masking whenever possible, or add masking when you're competing. All those are, we want to do something, but we don't want to do what has the highest scientific merit.
Okay. All right, so I guess then my other questions that I had sent were asking for information about if you were recommending masks, and it's hard to know whether or not I should be asking these questions because it's kind of hard to know where we're going to land because there's no decisions being made on this. But I do just want to put it out there, about if there's been anything looked at in regards to if that is the direction that is gone, do you have any information about masking of athletes and the impact on them and any risk that that might add to in any particular sports or any particular temperature-wise if they are outside? And you don't have to answer that now, but I would, if that's the direction, I feel like that's information that I would like to be able to review. But it's hard to know because I'm just getting a feeling there's recommendations and now there's different ones, because my understanding that was a recommendation being made. So, and so that said, so the mandatory staff testing that is mentioned, in other areas where that is done, do you know any specific impact on staffing as far as operational pieces, how it's been received from staff morale, that kind of thing?
Quantified, no, because the mandates themselves have really just started coming out in the last 2 weeks. And so we're not even at the point where those folks have met their due date yet. I think one district has had a September 1st due date, but the vast majority of them, we have not hit their due date yet.
Okay. Well, I have quite a number of other questions, and if it's possible, I'd appreciate my email being followed up on with the information. But I know I don't want to tie up it would take, I've got a lot of questions, so thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you, Chairman Sutton. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. I have a few questions, but I'm hopeful that these can be answered relatively directly with some shorter answers. I don't think I'm going to ask anything too complex. I just want to be clear on a couple points. First, on slide 12 that you presented, we skipped through it a little bit at the beginning. This is your keeping it real, reducing COVID in the schools, and you list some of the mitigation measures. My question is, how would you rank or prioritize these? Are these things that you would give equal weight to, or some more important than others? For example, you have the recommendation about the best practices to eat outside whenever possible. How important is that compared to masking outside or universal masking inside or some of your other recommendations?
Well, universal masking inside is clearly number one. Then monitoring, reporting data and monitoring is probably number two, depending on how many cases you're getting. And so some of that depends on the details of your district. Eating outside, lunch has the potential to cause you guys some problems. Then the vaccination strategies and lunch, I would put them on the similar plane. Vaccinations have a much more scientific merit, but everybody eats lunch. Then about several steps down from that, we get to recess.
Okay, thank you. Next, just going back to recess, in the example that you gave, you distinguished, for example, say an elementary school kickball game where everyone's spread out among different bases versus like a recess where everyone could be all clustered together. The example you gave was, everyone sitting on a bench clustered around an iPhone. Do you see, is that a significant difference? I mean, do you think that there is measurable measurable impacts, I guess, one being more safe than the other with, for example, like structured recess where kids can be distant or distanced out versus, unstructured recess where they're pretty much just doing their own thing and unmonitored? Is that something we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think that the easiest way to compare this to is to think about it like chicken pox. If you had recess where, sorry, I have somebody just home from school. If you have recess where you saw a bunch of kids running around with chicken pox, how would you think through that as a board member? And the mortality from chickenpox obviously very, very low. SARS-CoV-2 very, very low in children. The difference for you as a board member when you're thinking through that risk, do I want a bunch of kids on the playground with chickenpox together, is the kids can take SARS-CoV-2 home and very much infect their family members at home and light up the school with it, and more importantly, light up cases at home and drive the pandemic. I just have some uncertainty. The scientific community just has some uncertainty around recess because it's not well quantified. Mm-hmm. And that's why I just haven't made a strong recommendation a month ago and pressing one way or another here. This is something for you guys to discuss.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. It is something that when we look at the health impacts on children as we've gone through the pandemic, when we saw the rise in obesity rates and poor nutrition and things when many children were kept at home, we talked about one of the advantages to getting them in the building was an increase in health. If we can't have recess, I guess one of the questions is, if we can't have recess, do we lose that? Can we have recess? Can it be a safer recess? What can we do to still ensure some level of health and activity while keeping our kids safe? Just a few more, and again, I think these will be quick. On slide 28, when we're talking about ventilation, my telephone and my email has been blowing up with different parents all calling, trying to get, little portable HEPA filters into classrooms and everything. You talk about ventilation here, and I didn't understand this last bullet. Think of upgrading ventilation like masking at recess. Except for ventilation, you're spending millions of taxpayer dollars. So is this just that is the point that it's nice to have, but it's an expensive luxury? Is it effective? Does it make a quantifiable difference? Could you expound upon this just a little bit more?
Yeah, there's as little data as there is that showing that masking at recess reduces things. It's even less impressive for ventilation changes in the context of masking. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that the mask prevents that spewing, if you will, of virus all throughout the room because of how the virus is transported. So yes, it is very uncertain benefit. Schools have been successful without it to date, and it's very costly. Whereas school districts all over the country, there are plenty of school districts that are requiring some masking in the outdoor arena to one degree or another. The kids are able to do well with the masking outside. They'll do it.
Okay, thank you. The last two, and these might be almost like a yes or a no, and if it's a no, it's going to be a short answer. When you've been looking and studying districts across the country, I know that you looked at athletics and extracurriculars, and you came back with a recommendation about testing. I had someone ask about like our regional programs and our special ed students. and whether testing, because sometimes these are populations that have difficulty with masks, some have difficulty in complying with the protocols. Have you seen districts that have looked at testing of special education students? Is it something recommended? Is it not recommended? Is it something where there could be other health issues? Is that anything you've looked at?
Under the Alpha variant, or the ancestral variant, it was very low benefit for districts. The status of that with the Delta is unknown.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question then also, as you've looked at these districts across the country, as I read stories about school systems sending hundreds of kids home in quarantine, one thing that strikes out is that around the country, the quarantine periods in a lot of these districts and states are all very different. Some are sending kids home for like 2 to 3 days, and I know we've seen quarantine periods of up to 2 weeks. And I was curious, with the spread of districts around the country that you've studied, have you compared quarantine periods and quarantine policies and determined if there's any difference in the effectiveness of these quarantine policies in terms of COVID cases in the schools? And I guess if I can add to that, just because with the Delta variant in particular and its cycling time, it seems to be much more rapid, and I didn't know if that would impact that either.
Yes. So the places where quarantine have not been shown to be helpful is, mask on mask children in the mask on mask indoors. Just the risk there of transmission is low enough. Consistently, people have been able to not quarantine there successfully, even with widespread testing of those folks. The second place that folks have been successful to shorten quarantine is after the 5th day, get a test, and then return to school after the 7th day if that test is negative. Which is another strategy folks have used, and that both of which are outlined in the DHHS toolkit.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Vice Chair Mahaffey.
Thank you. So, Dr. Benjamin, when you are talking about masking at recess having some scientific merit but unproven intervention, what kind of data are you looking for to show that it does have merit?
Well, in what we would look at is the sorts of things that we've done with you in the indoor environment. So it's some additional data collection on the part of the school district, and it just it's not that this is a shortcoming for Wake or any other particular school district. School districts have just essentially taken the approach of, well, it's low enough risk, we're going to allow the kids to be outside en masse. Others have said, you know what, it's just simpler. We'd like to avoid the quarantine questions. It's not hard for the kids to be masked outside. The kids have been doing it for over a year now. Let's just leave the mask on and be done with it, rather than try to study it. You want the kind of study, at the very least, that we've done in the indoor environment. And then if that is replicated by others multiple times, as it has been in the indoor environment with different research groups using different methods, then that becomes much more robust data. And that includes not only, contact tracing and testing of the kids when their primary exposure to each other is recess in the elementary school setting.
Thank you. And in that same vein, you've talked about vaccination being the need, our athletes, extracurricular students to be vaccinated, but also, when not possible, masking and testing. My question is about outdoor athletic spectators at events where there may be more crowding now that, being outdoors, but is that something that concerns your collaborative, or you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the advantages to you there is that you can have folks distance. They don't have quite the intimacy that the athletes will have. They're not all riding across the county together on the same bus, getting in and out of the same locker room, that sort of thing, in the same bench area on the sidelines. So there's less concern there. It is unknown how much spectators will fuel the pandemic with Delta, whether it will be, if vaccination rates are in the 90s percentile, as they were with Lollapalooza, then the impact is very, very low. If the vaccination rate is less than 50%, you can see some impact there.
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson-Osler.
Thank you. Hopefully this will be a quick question as well, Dr. Benjamin. In the monitoring plan, is there verification for vaccination? Excuse me, when our schools or any of the schools are monitoring these to ensure that they're actually verified, since it impacts the quarantine, number of days quarantine for a student, if they're vaccinated or not?
So the primary thing that we recommend with the monitoring plan is you actually have school personnel, whether it's the assistant principal or the assistant superintendent or somebody identified in the school, to walk through the school and simply attest to the denominator is the number of human beings and the numerator is the number of human beings with mask over nose, mouth, and chin. And what's fairly commonly seen is there are schools that regularly drop below 90%. There are teachers within schools that regularly drop below 80, 70, even down to 50% in their adherence in their classroom. And it's driving those percentages all north of 90%, which is the goal of the monitoring program. Because unlike last year where a high, somewhere in the 80s probably carried the day with respect to masking, with the Delta variant, you're going to need a very, very high fidelity of mask compliance. Did that answer it? Because it's not so much about vaccination as you're monitoring and validating what fraction of your people are wearing masks throughout the day correctly.
It does. It just draws more questions, but those are questions that we'll have to talk about as a district in terms of how we contact trace and verify.
Mrs. Kushner.
Thank you. And as a quick follow-up to Ms. Johnson-Hosler, does the type of in your studies, does the type of mask matter? I know I hear you saying fidelity of mask wearing, but is that's a well-fitting mask what matters as opposed to a cloth or a medical mask or a neck gaiter?
We don't have the data of that granularity to tell you. That sort of differentiation is based on studies where folks look at what happens in the lab and then try to apply them. A thick cloth mask and a medical mask do not have much difference. There's a considerable drop off to the single ply cloth gaiter. And last year it probably wasn't that big of a deal, but that's going to be different. I speculate that's going to be very different this year. People recommended against the gaiters last year. This is an area, I think, of concern for districts that allowed gaiters last year. That those masks this year concern me much more than they did last year.
Thank you.
All right, Superintendent Moore, we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, for joining us today and
Thank you.
spending some time with us. I do believe that the next part of our presentation involves our county guest, Dr. Mashanga. Are you online?
I am. Thank you. Good afternoon.
If we could get the slide presentation back up. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be giving just a brief update of COVID-19 metrics here within Wake County, looking at some of our cases and then at vaccine. Next slide, please. This slide is showing our CDC COVID data tracker, really looking from August 25th through August 31st. You see the entire state of North Carolina is red, representing high transmission of COVID-19 within the community. Wake County highlighted in the gray. Wake County has now had over 100,000 cases. Our percent positivity has been ranging over 8% during this time period, and averaging just over 200 cases per 100,000 in a 7-day period. Next slide, please. This slide is taking a look at just how many of those cases we had by month. Really looking at the latter end. You can see these are the number of cases we've had since the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. You see our winter surge there in December and January, and then now what we've seen towards the end of July and through the month of August due to the Delta variant. We see that there's been a significant increase in the number of cases just in the month of August alone. And this slide, this is taking a look at the week-by-week case trends. Once again, looking at the entire pandemic from March of 2020. Things that I highlight in this particular graphic is seeing that our winter surge, looking at our 5 to 9-year-old age group. This is an age group that is not eligible for vaccine. So any of those below 11 are not eligible for vaccine, but particularly looking at our 5 to 9-year-olds. During the winter surge, they had about just under 200 cases at the height of the surge. What we have seen during our Delta surge is that the number of cases for our 5 to 9-year-olds has gone up significantly, ranging anywhere from 200 to over 360 cases per week for this particular age group. When we look at our vaccination metrics, you can see here, this is showing the difference between our fully vaccinated and vaccinated with at least one dose, comparing Wake County to those of North Carolina. Looking at fully vaccinated, we know that individuals that are fully vaccinated have the most protection against the Delta variant. 72.3% of those 12 and older are fully vaccinated in Wake County. 74% of those 18 and older, and then 61.2% of our total population are fully vaccinated here in Wake County. The metrics are slightly higher for those with at least one dose, and we're continuing to see increases in vaccination rates and vaccine requests for individuals within our community. Next slide. And this is just the last slide that I have that's talking about the percent of the population fully vaccinated by age here in Wake County. Once again, when I was here a few weeks back, we saw that we've had a pretty good increase in our 12 to 17-year-old population, now representing 58% of their population being vaccinated, and continue to see increases in gains week by week through a large majority of our age groups here in the county. Once again, one of our biggest highlights is that, we do know there's a group that is just ineligible for vaccine. And unfortunately, because of that, we are seeing higher numbers of cases within those younger age groups. And I will probably take any questions at this time.
Mrs. Kushner.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Chair Sutton, and thank you for being here today, Ms. Mashanga, Dr. Mashanga. And I was wondering about our staff has done a wonderful job getting vaccinated. Can you tell us about when we should start looking at booster shots for our staff?
So on our side, Wake County is preparing for booster doses. The date that we have been given has been September 20th. We are still waiting all official guidance before we open that up to eligible individuals. There has been a lot of kind of back and forth in the media about whether it'll be a 6-month eligibility or an 8-month eligibility. Our team does have the capacity to adjust, and we are just currently waiting official guidance before moving forward with offering those opportunities for boosters.
Thank you, and I hope you will work with the district so that we can get our teachers and educators and staff in line effectively so they can get those boosters. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Hegarty.
Thank you. And again, I appreciate you joining us today, Doctor. I'm curious, I want to follow up on a question that I'd asked Dr. Benjamin just about quarantine and quarantine policy. And please correct me if I'm misunderstanding this or if I have any incorrect information. Quarantine policy with regards to clusters is set by the Wake County Health Department. Is that correct?
Yes, based off of CDC and the NCDHHS toolkit.
And currently, Wake County Public Health requires a 14-day quarantine for a cluster?
For clusters, yes, that is correct.
And is that quarantine mitigated by anything such as vaccination status, mask use, or any other steps that might have been present where the cluster was identified?
If people are fully vaccinated, they would not, due to guidance, they would not have to quarantine. That is correct.
Okay, but other measures like masking and things like that, they would still be subject to the quarantine?
Yes, there's a bit of a challenge there. With each of these cases, our team works with the health services team at the school system to really try to narrow down contacts and who has been involved and who is involved in the cluster. There are some challenges that we have seen is that even though you can mitigate sort of quarantine options if you're wearing a mask, the mask needs to be worn consistently, and it has to be worn, as has been mentioned earlier, over the nose, mouth, and chin. And so there are quite a bit of requirements that have to happen in order for people to be able to access that option for quarantine. So it's although it sounds very simple, there are a lot of steps that go into making those decisions.
I understand. Thank you. And I appreciate that there's a lot of different factors that go in. And so then my last question is, as we look at just the emergence and the rise of the Delta variant, I don't know in the cases you identify, if you identify them by variant versus just any type of COVID, what the prevalence of the Delta variant is, but it seems like the cycling rate for the Delta variant is much faster in terms of when it presents and its incubation period. And if that's the case, do you think a 14-day quarantine period is still necessary if signs of infection, signs that can be detected of a positive test are going to be, or I guess they're going to have much faster onset?
So I hear exactly what you're saying and have seen the slides that were presented earlier. However, our recommendations and guidance are based currently off of CDC and NCDHHS guidance. So when there have not been any changes at this point in time to the incubation period, which is why there's a 14-day quarantine option.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate your explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Cash?
So I know we'll be talking about this further, but the fact that what are some things that we can do to help not quarantine so many children? And one of the things we're going to have to do, and we'll talk about later, I know some of us will, about the fact that the burden on the schools for the tracing is just way too much for administrators to handle right now. So what can a health department help us with for what we're trying to do?
So currently, what the health department does, I'll explain sort of our process. The cases are reported to, I believe, either to the school principal and to the health services department within the school system. At that point in time, information is gathered on the student or staff member and any contacts. And that information is then provided to our team here at the health department. Once we receive that information here at the health department, our team then verifies each case. We have to have a positive test result, positive lab result, in order for our team to proceed in the next steps of the process. Once they identify that positive case, they then send that to our case investigation staff. Our case investigation staff reaches out to either the parent or the most likely the parent, the child, or the staff member, and is able to gather more information about locations and places that they've been, any other exposures, or any other people within that household. That information is then sent to our contact tracing team, who then provides a digital monitoring period based off of the quarantine required for that particular case. At the end of that quarantine, our team will then check in and follow up with them to see if there's any other needs, or if it has to be extended by chance if they're not doing any better. And then that is the end of the process for us. So currently our team does do a significant portion of the contact tracing, case investigation and contact tracing, once it is provided to us for monitoring and follow-up.
Can you just follow up with what it is you have to have from the school personnel that you have to get from them? Like how many phone calls would they have to make, or who would they have to contact to get the information to you?
Yes. I'm sorry, you're saying to follow up with that. I can do that, yes.
No, well, I was just saying, if a school person sees a positive case, how many people do they have to speak to?
I can't say from the school's side how many people they would have to speak to, but I can say that once we receive that information, the person, the case, would speak to our case investigators, and then to one of our contact tracing staff members, so two other people on our end, unless there's significant concerns outside of that, but that would be the normal process.
If I could just step in for a second, I think it's going to vary, because if a student is positive and there's initial review at the school level of where there may have been exposures or contacts, that initial review happens at the school level and then is turned over for additional contact tracing where the health department gets involved. In some cases, if they were mask on mask and some other things were in place, it might be very few contacts. There may be others where the number of contacts is much larger. And it changes from day to day, because it may be that additional exposures come up, because then you go check to see what happened on the bus. And so sometimes there's a good number. And I just want to say that the lift of contact tracing is something that I have discussed with the county manager to see if there's a better way to partner on that, because it is a big lift on the schools. And we've hired additional staff in our health services department, but it is still a significant lift.
Yeah, I think it's like almost a full-time position, if not more, in the high schools anymore, and the middle schools and elementary, I know, are coming unglued with it, but it's a full-time position, if not two. So go ahead.
I have a follow-up, because this is where my question does fit, and that is, when our school personnel, whether it's AP or health services, whoever does it, two things. Are they verifying when a family says that, oh, no, my kid is vaccinated? And how do they verify that? And then the second piece of that question is, who's responsible to make sure that kid doesn't return to that building until their quarantine has ended?
So I can provide the vaccination answer that our team is able to access that information for people that were vaccinated within North Carolina. We can verify that, and it is verified before cases are sent on, just so that there is awareness, and because that person would not have to quarantine if they were fully vaccinated.
Thank you, Dr. Bashanga.
All right, Superintendent Moore, we'll continue.
Thank you, Dr. Mushonga, for joining us today and providing some information and answering questions. At this time, we are turning it back to staff for additional updates. And I believe Tim will be first with some updates to our dashboard.
Superintendent, as Superintendent Moore just mentioned, will sort of transition from the health guidance and the health officials to some of the more operational sides. I'm going to walk through for you a few changes to the dashboard, some of the things we've added and included, so you can begin to look at that information and marry it to the conversation that we've had to date. Most of the changes, if we could go to that first slide, most of the changes that we have made to date have fallen into 4 categories. The positive cases we've been doing, of course, since the beginning of the pandemic. These are listed by date, but they can now be sorted by column heading. Actually, it's a Google Sheet. You can sort it any way you want. And you will notice, particularly since the beginning of this school year, that the number of pending cases is generally significantly higher than it was last year, and that largely is a function of volume. The number of staff has not obviously increased as quickly as the number of cases, so you're going to have more pending cases. Clusters are also listed by date, includes the school and the facility. Those are not sortable. And it includes the cases at the time the cluster was declared. We'll get into a couple of examples here to show you how that works. Quarantines are now listed. Those went up this morning, late this morning. It lists the total per week, reports the number that are related to athletics, and then it includes the approximate percent of students and or staff who are quarantined, and we'll get into that in a moment too. And then the rest of the information, all of this is at wcpss.net/COVID-19. Would be things like vaccination sites, the details on face coverings, which I know we all get asked and answer frequently, when to stay home and when it's okay to return. So, Mr. Haggerty, that question you're asking is on that page too. And then, of course, just general info, which is where we would place it to update it. Again, wcpss.net/COVID-19 is that's the address I would wish that people would most remember, because it's kind of the easiest way to get in. If you look at the next slide, please. If you can't remember wcpss.net/COVID-19, wcpss.net will do. It's that cute little guy down there just below the icons under the COVID-19 response page. That has been there for a while. I do not anticipate that's going to be going anywhere, because that is your front door if you're unable to remember the wcpss.net/COVID-19. So real quickly, I'm going to walk through the little details about the 3 pages. So as I mentioned, the positive cases, this is essentially how we've done it from the beginning and how we will continue to do it. It's by date and location, as you can see there. And then the more recent the date, the more likely it's pending. The last on campus or facility is important, because that gives you some sense of when a student or staff member would have been on campus for a secondary transmission to occur. And then you can see the household, suspected household or community link, as well as the suspected campus link. That suspected campus link is then noted as a cluster if indeed you have 5 or more linked cases. And again, this is a Google spreadsheet, so at this point, if you want to sort it by date, by school, by suspected campus link, have at it. It's fairly straightforward to do, and allows you to take a look at schools. I know now that we've had more cases, understandably, we've had parents who say, I don't want to wade through 3 pages to find how many were at Abbott's Creek. I'm not picking on Abbott's Creek. They just happen to always be at the top of the list. This way you can sort it so that... Yes. So that walks you through the case. So the clusters are on a separate page, and again, if you go to the COVID-19 response page, you will see there's a call-out box that lists clusters and quarantines. Clusters are the tab on the left. We'll get to quarantines in a moment. That's the tab on the right. And at the moment, these are simply listed as they are declared. There's one little piece that's bothering me here, so I'm just going to point it out. There's a misspelling on that page, and it really bothers me. So we fixed it before it's fixed live, but in the presentation when we uploaded it. So the text here gives the user an idea of what a cluster is, that they have to be related, and that the key is finding clear links among the positive cases. And then, as we just discussed, when a cluster is declared, there's a 14-day quarantine period. And the quarantine applies to anyone in the group who tests positive or is exposed, even if they're not a direct link. So let me give you an example. You've got 5 fifth graders. The fifth graders have a couple of siblings. The siblings may have infected somebody at another grade level. These are all going to be listed as the number of cases at the time the cluster is declared. Again, the health department's purpose when they intervene at this point, if that's the right word, is to break the secondary chain of transmission. And so that number might be more than 7 when all is said and done, but all you're going to see in the dashboard is the number at the time that the case was declared. I mention this because we do have parents who say, I know there had to be at least 10 cases there or 11 cases there. That's not impossible. There are cases that emerge after the cluster is declared. It takes a while before the results come in, before they're reported and recorded. But this portion of the dashboard is just to make sure that as soon as a cluster is declared, we know that it gets up on the board so people can see it. So.
I just had a quick question about quarantine. Sometimes kids are quarantined for 21 days. Is that when there's something in the household, or what is that?
If there's, you can end up, and I'm going to lean on Paul or Kelly if I get outside of but you can have a quarantine get extended if you've got somebody in the household, yes. Yeah. In fact, that's a good opportunity to move to the last slide here on the dashboard, which is the quarantine section. And again, I won't walk through all that text, but the text at the top explains what the clusters are, explains what the chart is showing you, and probably the important takeaway for this chart is this tells you how many new cases of quarantines there were that week. It's not a snapshot of how many quarantines total there might be, because a quarantine could be theoretically as little as 1 day. Sunday night, I called in positive, but I'm vaccinated. They told everybody to stay home for 1 day. That's it. I'm back. It could be as long as 14 days. Those are your 2 most common. Ms. Cash, to your point, you can get them longer than that, but generally you're going to get 7, 10, or 14 days are going to be the number of days quarantined. And what this is telling you is in any given week, the number of students quarantined equaled whatever that number is. You can see that it has gone fairly steadily up. The week of 7-5 and 7-12 were either nobody was in school or it was a partial week. 7-19 would have been our first full week. Your percentages on the for students and staff for the initial part of the year, those percentages would have been based on about 40,000 students and 4,600 staff members. Then when we get to the week of 8-23, the first full week, it's based on about 149,000 kids, because that's about how many we have in person, and about just shy of 17,000 staff, because that's how many staff are in contact with kids on any given day. And then lastly on that chart, you'll see that the percent of staff and the percent of students has remained low to date. Now, I say that like I should knock on wood a little bit, but you've got 98, 99% of your kids in class, in in-person instruction, which is the 2 priorities that we've talked about repeatedly here, which is to get as many kids into in-person instruction as possible while keeping the quarantines as low as possible. Again, it's not a perfect measure, but it's a solid proxy as the weeks roll on so that we have something to measure against. This is information that's given to the ABC Science Collaborative, so I do not see us changing the way in which it's measured from here on out. So. Any questions, or should I move on directly to academic?
Yeah, let's try to get on through as much as we can.
All right.
And we'll take questions later.
I believe they're up next.
A lot.
Yeah.
We got quite a few slides.
I believe. Drew, are you next?
See, we'll get this done in 10 minutes, right? Good afternoon, everyone. Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, board members. In the next section of the presentation, we'll take just a few minutes to provide some school opening updates from academic advancement, followed by our operations division. You've already received, I know, a wealth of information, and much more is coming, so we'll do our best to be concise and move through the presentation as efficiently as we can. So our academics updates today will cover a brief overview of enrollment data, some of which Mr. Simmons just touched on, followed by information on the Virtual Academy, potential virtual alternatives that continue to be explored, and then I'll close with an update on our efforts to provide instructional support to students that are in quarantine and unable to attend in person. So first, here on slide 47, in terms of relevant enrollment information, slide 47 provides an overview of data and projected data that may assist in setting some broader context for our discussions on virtual learning options and also strategies to support students who are in quarantine. As you can see here, for the purposes of our district's planning and budgeting processes, our projected student membership for the 21-22 school year stands at a little over 160,000, specifically 160,591. That is still a projected figure at this point, as we don't yet have 10 and 20-day count totals, as we're just beginning, obviously, week 3 of the traditional calendar school year. Of that 160,000 student membership figure, a little more than 150,000, or approximately 93.5%, are projected to attend in person, with about 10,400, or about 6.5%, enrolled in the Virtual Academy. Again, these are still projections at this point. We should have a better handle on those numbers once we get those 10 and 20-day counts in the days and weeks ahead. Meanwhile, for additional context, Mr. Simmons just referenced this, the last bullet indicates the most recent update on the number of students that were quarantined for the week of August the 30th, which was, of course, the second week of the traditional calendar school year. Again, that number stands at 1,273, which is an increase from the 739 students that were quarantined the previous week of August 23rd, though it still represents less than 1% of the approximately 150,000 students attending school in person. Next slide. So with those data points providing some context, slide 48 provides a little more information on the Virtual Academy, starting with a breakdown of projected enrollments across each grade span. I don't have to read those to you. You can see those there, elementary, middle, and high school. In the next column, shaded in green, you see current information on Virtual Academy staffing as of August the 31st, which is an update to the staffing data that we shared in the most recent work session on August the 17th. Our Human Resources Department has been surveying principals monthly now regarding staffing needs since back in December of 2020, and this information comes right from that most recent report. The Human Resources Department also has continued to work around the clock to process recommendations each day, and once candidates are approved, they're moved through the remaining phases of the hiring process, including an online orientation. Of note here, among the 673 total Virtual Academy teacher positions, which include both school-based and district-allotted positions, we currently have 30 open positions and a vacancy rate of 4.5%. One quick note on that data point, just to be clear, that I think is important to point out. A 4.5% vacancy rate is certainly an improvement over the number that you saw just 3 weeks ago, and we're absolutely happy to see it. However, it is important to point out that not all of our progress has been as a result of hiring new teachers and filling vacancies. There were instances where it became apparent, or was becoming apparent, that we were not going to be able to find teachers, making it necessary for us to use the North Carolina Virtual Public School courses at times, and also even contract, as we referenced a couple of weeks ago, with our own Wake County Public School System educators to teach additional courses during their planning periods. So that vacancy rate has gone down, but not solely because we've just been able to fill those openings on a large scale. It's been a combination of hiring a few folks and also mitigating the need for additional staff using the strategies I just described. Just a few other Virtual Academy items worth mentioning here as we enter week 3, believe it or not, week 3 of the traditional calendar Virtual Academy and week 6 for our year-round that started on track 4. First, the implementation of the Virtual Academy has been possible because of the collective effort and brilliance, I would say, of our teachers, principals, deans, assistant principals, counselors, school-based Virtual Academy contexts, numerous central service departments, all too many to call out individually. It's also, I think, though, appropriate, as I mentioned, NCVPS, to extend a kudos and a thank you to our colleagues at NCVPS who have been an invaluable partner with us, especially over the last few weeks, in trying to fill some of those gaps created by some of the staffing vacancies that we talked about. The district VA team has, of course, been closely monitoring both successes and early challenges over the first few weeks of the school year. Schools are sharing that students and teachers are engaged in building a virtual classroom environment and a strong community of teaching and learning. As with in-person schedules, traditional calendar schools have been working diligently over the past couple of weeks to make any needed final adjustments to course schedules based on student needs. Early on, as some of you may have become aware, we were aware of student issues with logging in to some classes. In the virtual learning environment, some of these technical glitches were to be expected during the first week or so of school. Again, I would give a shout out to our school staff and our district staff who worked around the clock, manning, for example, the Virtual Academy Let's Talk system. And I mean, literally, individual students were contacting us, and we had folks at the district office and in schools responding almost in real time in some cases to get them up and running. So again, kudos to those folks. As we've referenced, and as is the case in most other areas of our operation, the most significant issues with the Virtual Academy have been around staffing challenges, particularly at the high school level. In some cases, the inability to find and hire qualified instructional staff has impacted the implementation of the instructional model as designed. Again, primarily at the secondary level, we did use, as we mentioned, pay for planning with our teachers and NCVPS to ensure that students had a stable, consistent learning experience with highly qualified and North Carolina certified teachers throughout the semester. Some of these changes did create some last-minute schedule adjustments. Quite frankly, it's one of those situations where we were faced with the task of trying to predict how soon or if we might be able to get a teacher in a given area. And you know, the week or two before school started, we made some tough decisions and had to go ahead with the presumption that we would not find a teacher. I think many of us who have kids in the system have experienced, unfortunately, periodically, even in normal circumstances, starting a school year with a long-term substitute. The inability and the challenge to find teaching staff has been compounded, likewise, with the inability to consistently find subs, and particularly long-term subs. And thus the reason for some of the decisions that required us to make some adjustment to schedules just before the school year. And in closing on that last slide, we'll certainly continue to work in our partnership, keep the board informed moving forward. But thus far, we are hearing positive returns from a lot of our families, even those that did have some ups and downs with technical issues and some schedule adjustments just as the school year was starting. See slide 49. Speaking of the Virtual Academy, we do know that there continue to be a few instances where schools are hearing from families who no longer wish to have their student attend in person as planned, whether due to the student or family having health concerns and/or issues with masking requirements, et cetera. While the virtual academy is at, and in some cases beyond capacity with the staff we currently have, the process of evaluating and reevaluating potential options continues to be ongoing. And this slide speaks to that a little bit. Any effort to expand the capacity of the virtual academy at this point, as I think we all know and understand, does come with some significant and, quite honestly, in some cases, insurmountable challenges. For example, given the staffing issues we've already referenced, it's simply not realistic at this point to believe that attempting to post and hire additional virtual academy positions to expand capacity offers a viable solution. We've not been able to fill the vacancies we have, so hiring more staff to expand capacity is just not feasible at this time. We've also looked, as we've mentioned before, to outside contracted vendors, and currently we do have an RFP out, but what we continue to hear from some of these companies and other districts across the state engaged in the same effort is that the private sector's capacity to provide services on a significant scale is also diminished, as they too are struggling to find qualified staff to meet the overwhelming demand, not just regionally, but obviously across the country. There are also some significant drawbacks instructionally associated with the external contracted private vendor model as well, not the least of which is the ability to provide services consistently to students with disability and other student populations. All that said, we will continue to exhaust every effort in this area to see what may be possible, but based on what we presently know in terms of the external vendor contract, it's increasingly unlikely that this option will be feasible in the near future. So we're left then with other unattractive alternatives that may not be impossible, but ones which come with some significant trade-offs and opportunity costs that we'd really like to avoid if at all possible. These include things like increasing class sizes in the virtual academy, where many are already high, moving students currently in in-person instruction to other sections at their school to free up a teacher to move to virtual academy, essentially collapsing an in-person section, freeing up a teacher, moving the teacher to virtual academy to meet whatever local demand there might be for that virtual option. And then finally, something that none of us want to have to do, the last option that you see listed there is asking faculty to again engage in concurrent teaching. I think we all remember last spring, teachers, parents, principals, the board were all very clear about the difficulties of concurrent teaching. We were very open about that, and that's why it's not part of our current virtual academy model. Concurrent teaching not only creates a significant additional burden on our teachers, we know that it can also have a negative impact on the instructional experience for the 94% or so of the district students that are attending school in person. So again, that's not an impossible option, but it is an option that comes with some trade-offs, opportunity costs, and significant consequences. Perhaps on a slightly brighter note, as we close out the academic section here, we did want to provide a quick update regarding ongoing and planned efforts to support students who are quarantined. First, I think I'll start by, I think it's the obvious here. I think it's fair to say that the best instructional strategy for students in quarantine is to do everything we possibly can to avoid a quarantine in the first place. And much of the information, the data that you've already seen, much of what you'll see and discuss later in the meeting tonight revolves around that. That said, despite our very best mitigation efforts through masking and other related health protocols, unfortunately, we know that quarantines are a fact of life right now, as evidenced by the fact that we do have, as of last week, over 1,200 of our students that were out of class because of quarantine. So when quarantines do occur, there are several support strategies that our schools have been deploying to provide instructional support. Just kind of a recap of some of those things that you see on the left side of the slide here. Again, all schools utilize the Students' Learning Management System, LMS landing page in Canvas or Google to support students who may be absent. Just again, a review. The landing page, it's really incredible, and I can't overstate what this can provide that we didn't have access to universally just a few years ago. It provides students and families with consistent information about all kinds of aspects of the course, including class assignments, reading, classroom activities, links to instructional videos or recordings from teachers, rubrics, assessments, family homework supports, and many others. Teachers are also updating this information regularly, and as students are entering their classrooms the first couple weeks of the school year, they're engaged in orienting their students to that page, so if the time comes when they can't be at school, it won't be a new endeavor for them. Additionally, school staff are providing regular live office hours for student connection, engagement, and direct support, and all those are things that are already and have been happening now for several weeks. In addition, we're also working to implement plans to contract with Wake County Public School System teachers to provide a district-level menu of after-hours live tutoring across grade levels and content areas. Now, I think you can see the challenge here. Once again, we're tapping into a limited resource when we're talking about our own internal district staff. And that's going to require some adjustments. In some cases, if it's a case where a teacher is scheduled, for example, to attend and facilitate a live tutoring session in third grade math, if the buses are running late, or if there's additional assistance that's needed after school for some other school function, we would have to defer to whatever the needs are of the school. And so there will be times when we'll probably have to have some backups in terms of what additional offerings might be available. But all of this is intended to supplement what schools are doing already, not replace it. We deployed a survey, late last week, and I think in checking this morning, we've already heard from over 200 teachers that have expressed an interest in being paid a stipend for after-hours extra duty pay. The other advantage of that is it does allow us to extend the school day in some instances where, kids may not be able to have access during the day, and perhaps they need a parent to be around to help them navigate, particularly our younger kids. And so we're excited about the prospect. There's still some logistics and work to be done there, and again, challenges at every turn, but we do feel like that's an opportunity to support and supplement what our teachers in schools are already doing across the district. As noted on the slide, kind of as a backup to the backup plan, we've also got an RFP out right now to explore online tutoring services, again, to see if we can't meet the need and demand with our own internal capacity. Again, we're looking at what we might be able to do externally. So I'll close by saying that, as is the case with so many areas of our operations right now, our teachers, our schools, and our district staff are working around the clock to support students in quarantine, and for that matter, in a variety of other circumstances. And as always, we'll keep seeking to adjust and improve our services and supports as circumstances require. So that was about as quick as I could go, and happy to take questions now or later.
So I appreciate you, Mr. Cook, and trying to move through that very quickly. Unless board members have any really quick or brief questions for Mr. Simmons or Mr. Cook, I'm going to move us to go ahead and adjourn the work session and try to move us into our board meeting, and then we'll continue the updates and questions during the information item of our board meeting. Is that? So we'll just continue. Yes, unless there's something that you just. Okay. That good? Fair enough? Okay. All right.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. So just hang around, if you will.
Not going anywhere. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, board members, for that. So we will adjourn the work session now and take a few minutes to transition. I know we have folks waiting to get in, and that might take some time as well. So we'll take about 10 or 15 minutes and then transition to our board meeting as soon as possible. So we'll stand adjourned. Thank you all.